Zimbabwe cash crisis worse. Talking about Venezuela once again.
Systemic important banks. They removed the one factor you do with this thing right here called monetary
Next recession.
Recession will be
A recession.
We're going to hit a recession.
The date of the next recession.
a U.S.-only recession typically lasts 8 to 10 months, but a lot of things about this particular one have not been typical. So
a crash is coming. Now, whether it's 6 months from now, 12 months, 36 months, no one knows.
I go to bed every night, I dream of another recession. If you know what to do, if you have the right plan to set up, you can make a lot of money from this.
Hey there, back at you today with another RT News update, and as you can tell from today's title, China pulls the plug on the US dollar, and it's a very interesting article from the Daily Reckoning out of Australia over this past weekend, and it's quite lengthy but yet very descriptive as to how the IMF, the SDR, as well as the United States of America might be playing an active role in the whole idea of China de-dollarizing their economy. And so, give you an idea what's going on here, I'll thumb through some of the details of this article here. But more importantly, if you want to find out more for yourself, I encourage you to take the time to read it for yourself. But just on the surface, it talks about how things are moving fast in China. It says the Chinese government is rushing to implement a series of changes to its currency before the coming global monetary reset. Says this reset has the US dollar firmly in the crosshairs. Says once in play, it will signal the end of the Bretton Woods agreement that has defined the global monetary system for 75 years. And with it, the end of the US dollar as the world's sole reserve currency. National currencies won't disappear, but the US dollar's hegemony will. Says providing liquidity in its place will be the International Monetary Fund's special drawing right, which has been earmarked to replace the dollar as the reserve currency. Says the SDR is simply an international reserve asset created to supplement member countries' official reserves. Then scroll down a little bit more. It talks about how that will come into play. It says the real reason China wants to trade oil in the yuan. It says China announced a pilot program beginning later this past year to purchase imported oil in yuan. It said it wants to create a benchmark equal to Brent and West Texas Intermediate. It also wants to reduce its dependency on the US dollar in oil trade. So yet this move was only partly about China weaning itself off US dollar dependency. Says after all, the yuan is not going to replace the US dollar as a world reserve currency on its own. Said that isn't China's intention anyway, not least because the yuan has a massive liquidity problem. Then it goes on to talk about, as estimated, 90% of transactions in the currency markets involve the US dollar, compared to just 4% of the yuan. The gap is too far vast for any serious challenges to the dollar's dominance. It says rather, the push to allow oil trading in yuan is meant to boost the international use and appeal of China's currency, which begs the question, why did the IMF, a US-led institution, accept yuan's inclusion in the basket? It says, at a glance, the list of criteria for eligibility should raise eyebrows. Then it goes on to mention 4 criteria. It says, it's arguable the yuan fails to meet any of these criteria above. That's because yuan inclusion had little to do with the usage in global finance. It was a political move. Otherwise, the US, and by extension, the IMF, wouldn't be accommodating yuan's internationalization as it has, and it almost certainly wouldn't be giving China a leading role in influencing the future of global monetary system. So why is it doing it exactly? 2 reasons. First, which we covered a few weeks ago, which can be understood if you accept the idea that international banking elites control the global finance. Seen from this perspective, you'll realize that undermining the US dollar position as reserve currency is a key plank of their policy, not least because it brings them a step closer to the centralization of the global financial system, which is the ultimate goal. And then second point, crucial to our argument today, though not unrelated to the first, is that the IMF and by extension the US has earmarked China for an important role in the coming reset. China to the rescue. Says during the next crisis, central banks will have the ammunition left to maintain stability. Says decades of monetary easing have given them little room to maneuver. The Federal Reserve knows this. That's why they're desperately trying to raise rates now and hope that it will have enough room to slash rates to offset the effects of the future crisis. That's the theory anyway. Then it goes on to say, yet no amount of rate cutting will be sufficient to stave off a monetary crisis, which is where the SDR comes into play. It says SDRs will form the bulk of liquidity in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. However, any widespread issuance of SDR requires China's help. So that's because the usefulness of SDRs extends only as far as they're able to be swapped for other reserve currencies. So as you can see why the U.S. has no reservations about the yuan's inclusion in the SDR basket. It says the issuance of trillions in SDRs during the next reset will allow China to dump US dollars in exchange for SDRs. So this is the biggest point of this article right here. It says the issuance of trillions in SDRs during the next reset will allow China to dump US dollars in exchange for SDRs. So the question would be, once China dumps the dollars for the SDRs, what will happen to all those dollars floating around? That's the bad part. They will come back to the United States of America, causing massive problems. Then it goes on to say, that explains why the U.S. needs China's help. For the U.S., it's either that or the prospect of hyperinflation and panic on the streets unlike anything seen in its history. If this takes place, the U.S. dollar will lose its global reserve currency. It will become no more important than the euro or the yuan. With significant hoardings of both SDR and gold, the yuan will see its importance in the global finance surge. That's not to say the US dollar will die, it won't, and most currencies, despite the prospect of severe inflation, aren't likely to disappear either, but the SDR, with a weighting balance to ensure that no currency dominates, will take on a greater role in the monetary system. China's move to internationalize the yuan through oil markets should be seen in this context then. The Chinese are laying the necessary foundations in order for the next monetary reset to commence. So here we have the idea that an SDR basket even being mentioned. It will help China unload some of those dollars and not really have much of a loss because they're not going to cause a massive panic and a flood of those treasuries and bonds onto the market. So what they're basically looking to do is exchange all those dollars that they have in their reserves now for SDRs, which will allow them to not have to unload, which will at least not leave them with the short end of the stick in the fact that if they dump all those dollars, they'll be the ones missing out. At least they supposedly can exchange those for SDRs. And I assume that if this was a possible scenario, then the world would be willing to accept more paper in the form of SDRs. But what it doesn't talk about here is the importance of gold in this question here. So we know that China and Russia and all those Eastern nations are collecting a massive amount of gold. So it's good to say that gold might be mentioned in that SDR basket as well. That's why there's such a need and desire for all those nations to hold on to gold at this point in time. So that leads me to wonder what would happen to all those dollars if China was to dump them in exchange for the SDRs. In that case there, all those dollars would inevitably come back home to roost where they were created, as well as all the other national currencies that will be exposed for being government liabilities, which is what they actually are. And the fact that the government borrows them from a private central bank. And in the case of the United States of America, we borrow them from the Federal Reserve Bank with the promise of paying them back plus interest. And so it's good to say that the Federal Reserve note will continue to circulate in this country with no credibility on the international scene, because it's good to say that no one will need Federal Reserve notes, aka dollars. So they'll be just more so a domestic currency. And so as my prior guest Jim Willie mentioned, how that at that point the Federal Reserve note will no longer have its dominant status as an international reserve currency. Therefore, here in America, everything we know now as far as a comfortable living standard, it will bring into question the purchasing power of the Federal Reserve note, which will then lead to a lack of faith and confidence in paper money altogether. And at that point, I can see the Federal Reserve or the Treasury issuing some form of a new currency here in the country just to attempt to try to regain confidence with the public in regards to being able to purchase goods and services with some form of a medium of exchange. So just wanted to share this article because it presents a different perspective in regards to the whole SDR being implemented and how China could unload their balance sheet of Federal Reserve notes into the market without really taking much of a loss in the form of exchanging them for SDRs. So that's a different spin upon this whole narrative of de-dollarization. So I wanted to share it with you. Let me know your comments down below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this matter. And if you find this important, please share this with family and friends. And more importantly, remember to subscribe and hit the notification tab for more RT News updates as well as live streams. See you later.